I think that the way that we end up in these polarized, tribalized, constantly self-reinforced things is really comes from a spiritual thing. It comes from the challenge of dealing with our own complexity and the desire to not have to deal with our own complexity. And if we instead realize that we are all tremendously complex and that that's just a spiritual struggle that we have to deal with, and also something that technology can help with us, the defining challenge for us is dealing with that complexity, then we get into a space of having systems that actually we're citizens of many things, of many localities, and that plurilocality becomes the foundation for us to have a governance system that is fit for purpose because it fits the richness and diversity of ourselves and our politics.
Glen, welcome to the Accidental Gods podcast, and thank you. And how are you, and where are you this lovely Friday afternoon?
Amanda, I'm in Bogota, Colombia, and I'm so delighted to be joining you and to have made your acquaintance recently, so doing great.
Yes, we recently made acquaintance, and I am exploring the world of Glen Weyl and entirely enthralled. And there are so many things that we could talk about. But here in the UK, we're in the middle of a general election. The French just discovered they are in the middle of a general election. And all around the world, there are other elections happening. And it feels as if the world is at an intersection of so many different tipping points and trajectories. And that the nature of democracy is being called into question and could definitely be improved. I've spoken to a number of people for election specials, and every single one has agreed that the current system is no longer fit for purpose, if it ever was. And you and Audrey together at the Plurality Institute and with your book, Plurality, have been exploring exactly this. And I have to say at the start, you're the creator of quadratic voting. And when I discovered that existed, it was one of the most exciting days of my podcasting life because it seemed like here is a way through. It was like when I was writing historical novels and I discovered that Joan of Arc was not who we'd been told and that here was this person that it obviously was, and everything fell into place. And quadratic voting. Oh, we could actually do something useful that isn't just people flailing around in the Middle Ages trying to work out how to count tally sticks better. So let's go back up to the beginning, because it seems as if you guys are really thinking deep and wide and far. In your opinion, what is governance for in the 21st century? Because if we know what it's for, we can shape it. If we're just shaping it based on what it is at the moment, I don't think we're going to get to where we need to be. Over to you.
I think that there's lots of complexity one can give in answers to that question, but I think often giving this very simple answer is the best starting point. And I would just say one word, which is peace. Peace is something that every major religion, every major moral tradition prizes above so many other things. And if you go back to the roots of what many people would say is the reason for democracy, they would say peaceful transfer of power. When opinions change, we give it over to a majority so they don't have to violently seize control. I think that the majoritarian conclusions from the idea of peace have a lot of limitations, but I think that basic idea that peace is what we are after has a lot going for it.
Brilliant. And I'm assuming, because I've been listening to a lot of what you've said, that peace is innately conjoined with human flourishing in your mind, because if everybody died, it would be peaceful. And there are people on the kind of deep adaptation.
Peace is not enough.
Yes.
Yeah, peace is not enough. And that's why I said it's an overly simplistic answer. But peacemaking is maybe a little bit better a term. And the real thing that I would want to get at is beyond that. It's not just peace, because peace is the absence of conflict. What we really want is the harnessing of human diversity for progress, beauty, growth, not just the absence of the waste of that energy. To give a longer answer, what I would say is that the reason why conflict has so much energy and can do so many destructive things is because it has potential. There's potential energy there, just the same way that we know when we see nuclear explosions, or we know when we see fires, that there's energy there.
Right.
In the same way, we know from the destruction that human conflict creates that there's potential there that can be harnessed. And so really the point of governance, I would say, taking it one step further, is the harnessing of the energy inherent in human diversity for productive aims, which includes avoiding it being dissipated as conflict and war, but has actually a higher calling, which is to harness it for growth and learning and beauty.
Beautiful. Thank you. That reminds me a lot of Zach Stein, the educational philosopher, talking about what is humanity for, and pretty much, I think if we all narrow down, we get to that sense of human flourishing within the bounds of a living planet that is also flourishing. I don't think many of us want the planet turned into a desert while humanity progresses. And then we can get into the wrinkles of what is a good human. But let's stay this side of that, because that's probably quite a long and deep philosophical conversation. And I've noticed you're an economist, you're also a philosopher, you're also a visionary, you're also a thought leader. You're also incredibly well versed with technology. So maybe we'll come back for the philosophical conversations. But at the moment, we need a governance system that allows human flourishing within a peaceful, or at least a conflict-free. No, we don't necessarily want conflict-free, because I think the edges of energy are where when humans have conflict, but conflict that doesn't burst out into violence, where the edge energy of my opinion and your opinion are not the same, but if we come together in good faith, we can produce something that is different to what either of us has brought, and perhaps is emergent and different and beautiful and all of the things that you want. And this is a metaphor that you bring up quite a lot in the book, that sense of fire being something that can be destructive and that we used to want to tamp down, and now we harness fire and turn it into good use. So a lot of our existing governance systems seem to do this very badly, and they also seem to claim authority from the fact that they exist at all. So it seems to me we have two questions. How could we create a governance system that allows peaceful flourishing and which has an authentic claim to authority that says this is actually the best we can get? I sat in a hustings night before last and listened to somebody churn out the old Churchill saying that democracy is the worst system except for all the other systems. And first of all, he said that almost 100 years ago, and it wasn't true even then. And it certainly isn't true now. So, or depending on how we label democracy, but the existing two-party, first past the post, let's scream at each other across the House of Commons that is set slightly more than 2 sword lengths apart because that's how we evolved it, that's not fit for purpose. So, how do we find the authority to create a system that people will get behind? Is that a reasonable question, or would you rather create a system and then we'll assume that it has authority?
Well, let me give 2 challenges to the assumption that the current systems that you're describing are good ways of thinking about democracy or governance, and then we can get into how we might address things in that way. So the first challenge I'd give is that if our goal is some notion of peace, some notion of peaceful transfer of power, of avoiding destructive conflict, I would argue that what's necessary for that is not the peaceful transfer to whoever happens to be in the majority at a moment. Instead, the key goal has to be the avoiding of the consistent reinforcement of the same lines of social division. Because even if you have a 51-49, and the majority gets it and then the majority gets it the other time, that doesn't really avoid conflict if the people who are on either side of the conflict are consistently the same group of people, because they will come to develop grievances, they will come to develop other sense of other, they will come to dehumanize whoever is on that other side. And that will cause conflict.
Yeah.
So we need systems that consistently avoid that reinforcement of the same lines of division. The second challenge I would give is that what does democracy mean? Was South Africa, prior to the end of apartheid, a democracy? Well, some might say, well, look, they had voting among the polity. So it was a democracy.
Right.
But I think many, I hope most, would say that when you take 95% of the population and exclude them from the right to vote, that's not a democracy. And so to have a democracy, we need, as the philosopher John Dewey, one of my favorite philosophers, pointed out, not just to have voting. You need to have an alignment between the set of people who are voting on decisions and the set of people who are impacted by those decisions. And that's a hard thing to do. And it requires that as the ways in which we're interdependent and the way we understand our interdependence changes, that we evolve our understanding of who is the polity and what are the jurisdictions that are relevant. And so if that's right, then the systems that we currently have some elements of voting, but they're not democracy in that sense any more than, pre-apartheid South Africa was a democracy in that sense.
Brilliant. And I've been listening to people recently who are working really hard at a legal level to give personhood to rivers and trees and mountains. And then presumably we find ways of giving them voice so they can vote. And in the Welsh Assembly, quite near to here, they have a commissioner for future generations whose job is to give voice to the people yet unborn. So there are beginnings of expanding that polity. We take a segue to the peaceful transfer of power. And another of the books that completely changed the rewiring of my brain was Graeber and Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything. Are you familiar with that?
Me as well.
Okay.
I would say that's one of maybe my favorite nonfiction book of the last decade.
Excellent. So. Yes, me too. And so he was talking about the Wendat and a man whose name I never know how to pronounce, Kadiarunk or something like that, who was a representative of the people that we got to know as the Huron because we all read Last of the Mohicans when we were children. And he said very explicitly, nobody tells me what to do. They seemed to have systems of connection and discussion and conversation that were explicitly designed, social technologies that managed to minimize conflict and had built into them ways, as far as I could tell, of there being very little sense of power happening anyway. There are the people who are good at hunting or building or constructing or debating. And when you need someone who's good at hunting, building, constructing, or debating, you bring them forward. And when you don't need them, somebody else comes forward. Our culture is built on hierarchies of power. Are we looking forward, do you think, within the 21st century, to a point where we could aspire to the kind of culture that the Wendat had, where power is a fluid thing and we're not having to take the power to govern and transfer it amongst people to get to, I guess, to a more distributed democracy? Is that an aim that you can see being worth exploring?
Well, what I absolutely love about the Graeber and Wengrow book is that it stokes our imagination. My colleague, Jaron Lanier, somewhat indelicately, but I think quite articulately put it, that it was a tremendous laxative for imagination on social organization, and I think that we live in a very scaled and technologically sophisticated society where we have affordances with information technology that allow us to configure things in ways we never could before. I think a big part of the reason that, as David Graeber in his previous book on debt argued, that we developed money in the first place was that it was very hard to do the rich social accounting that occurred in small-scale societies across very large social distances. And I think that the reason it was hard to do that was that we had very primitive information technology at the time.
Yeah.
So we used a very reductive thing of, the number of tallies that you have on some sheet or the weight of some, metal that you have to carry across those distances. And maybe we just don't have to do that anymore. Maybe network technology is a way to capture a lot more of the richness that exists in small scale societies in a way that scales. Now, there are all kinds of dangers inherent in that. But I think that as much as we can and should take inspiration from Graeber and Wengrow, I think it would also be a huge mistake to not avail ourselves of the affordances that modern technology offers us to expand the way we do that accounting, because otherwise we may find ourselves again trapped into trying to scale using these very primitive tools that then reduce us back to these simplistic things like money.
Yeah, or we end up purely having Dunbar numbers of people because that's the number that you can actually manage, because we still do have our Paleolithic emotions and we haven't quite upgraded those yet. That's another conversation, but it seems to me you're one of the few people I've ever met who could talk about how do we upgrade our own consciousness to match the capacity that technology is giving us. Let's park that one for now, but let's think about it for another time. So, we want a governance system that enables everyone to flourish in a peaceful way, that doesn't create power hierarchies over, and particularly doesn't create power hierarchies in binaries where, I don't know, Brexit won by 1.8% and they got to destroy the world, and then the Remainers would win next time by 1.8% and they get to upset all the Brexiteers, and in the end everybody hates everybody else. We want to create more emotionally literate forms of governance. I am guessing, also I read the book, that we want to create forms of governance that are more locally aligned, such that if there's a problem with the sewage system near here, which is happening in the UK because they privatised the water system, and we want to take that back, we get to define how it works because we're here. Whereas things that need to be done on a national level get done on a national level. There aren't many of those once you start to think about it. How do we structure this? I think we need to look at how do we move from one to the other later, but what would an ideal governance system for, let's stay with the Hobbesian concept of nations at the moment, a geographic entity that claims the monopoly of power and violence within set boundaries. Let's assume that the nation state is a nation state for a while. If we were to completely redesign a governance system, what would it begin to look like in the 21st century?
So the first thing I would challenge a little bit is the word ideal.
Okay.
I actually think that when we seek a utopia or an optimized system or a perfect state, we actually force ourselves into a tremendous amount of conservatism.
Okay.
And the reason is that no one ever has the courage to do something truly radical if they think that they have to work everything out themselves and can't be allowed to fail. Because when you have to just project what is starting from scratch, the best new thing, you'll just take some version of what already exists and just recreate it. In fact, you said this precisely in your book. You said revolutions just take us back to where we started, right? So the way that we actually are radical, I believe, is by being experimental, by understanding that whatever it is we do, at most we can hope to be good enough ancestors. A good enough ancestor is someone who tries to maximize the freedom of the next generation to define the future. And that requires that you not destroy the world, that you not undermine the capacities that are available, but it also requires that you not prescribe the world and set down the way that things are going to be ideally forever. It means that you seek to open the space for the future to continue iterating and defining itself. And of course, that's how we approach technology. Like, nobody says, let's go design the ideal communication medium. I mean, that's nonsense. Everyone knows, like, imagine if in the 1910s, people had said, let's design the ideal communication medium. It would be like an optimized form of radio, and you would have completely precluded the possibility of television or
what we're talking on now.
So what we're talking on now, right? Exactly. So instead, I would say, what are some really interesting steps we might take and maybe fail in that might give us a really different starting point that would empower the future to iterate further and improve further.
Okay. Go for it.
And
what are they?
So let me give some thoughts on that. One is, I love the idea of locality. And I would also encourage us to think in terms of plurilocality. So there is no one locality that we have. You are local, perhaps, to people who speak. I understand you speak some of the Celtic languages. So, maybe you're close to people who are connected in that way. Or perhaps you're close to people who exist in a similar watershed to you, or to people who steward a particular mountain range, and all of those are different because, of course, a mountain range is like a point. A river is a line or a curve. Language is spread out in all sorts of interesting different ways. And then we can go to other formations. There can be things related to carbon. There can be things related to historical power structures like nations that have, developed attachments, which don't necessarily line up with any of these other things perfectly either. There can be religious configurations, which often cross all kinds of boundaries. So there are many forms of locality, and they intersect with each other. And so I think we absolutely need to embrace locality, and we need to embrace locality with an understanding of the diversity that constitutes us. Because I think that the way that we end up in these polarized, tribalized, constantly self-reinforced things really comes from a spiritual thing. It comes from the challenge of dealing with our own complexity and the desire to not have to deal with our own complexity and to instead have some notion that there is some set of people out there that shares enough with us that we can just sort of throw away the rest of the world and just be with those people and be in a safe space. And if we instead realize that we are all tremendously complex and that that's just a spiritual struggle that we have to deal with, and also something that technology can help with us, the defining challenge for us is dealing with that complexity, then we get into a space of having systems that actually we're citizens of many things, of many localities, and that plurilocality becomes the foundation for us to have a governance system that is fit for purpose because it fits the richness and diversity of ourselves and our politics.
And it upgrades us from the Paleolithic emotions, because if people follow what you just said, you can't end up with one set of people whose basic principles demand that another set of people not exist. On
Exactly.
racial, gender, sexual orientation, any of those things, that can't happen. There has to be Ubuntu. I am because you are. And there has to be that sense of we're all here doing our best, and our job is to let other people do their best, and their best does not involve telling anybody else how to behave within, presumably, reasonably broad boundaries.
And it also puts us in a place where conflict doesn't have to be the enemy, as long as conflict doesn't constantly reinforce the same lines of division. The way I think about a society is very much like a quilt. The problem in a quilt, if you think of a conflict as a stitch in the quilt, the problem is not stitches. Quilts need stitches. The problem is if all the stitches are in the same direction,
Right.
the quilt will rip.
Right.
Right? But if the stitches constantly cross-cut each other, then the quilt is strong. And that, I think, is, the model we need to have for, design of social and governance technologies.
Yeah. You need the people to buy in. I think we're moving ahead to how do we make this happen. But the people who currently own the power to control the weapons need to buy in to letting go of that power. But maybe they'll do that if they can see that what we have is a system that could conceivably create a future that they might want to step into. Let's have a little bit more of a look at the actual logistics of how we get there. Or not how we get there, but what the structures might look like. So we've got what Indra and Pat call cosmolocalism. You just defined it brilliantly. It's lovely.
Exactly.
And any of us, or even Primavera de Filippi and the concept of coordinations, that we can belong to our communities of place and a purpose and a passion, and that these intersect and that they can flow, and our ideas can flow between them. Having got all of that, governance becomes something more than the transfer of power then. it becomes, I would imagine, aggregates of people who understand how water flows, coming together, picking the best of the people who actually get how water flow, while the rest of the community defines we need our water to be clean and we need it to flow downhill and we need to have enough for the crops and for us and we need not to be contaminating the sea, make that happen. Or we need to grow food. You guys are really good at growing food. Let's grow and distribute food. Let's organize that. That our existing governance systems, it seems to me, have emerged out of the trauma cultures of the Fertile Crescent, mostly. I mean, Rome imported the trauma culture to the UK, and it changed from being an incredibly fertile area to progressively less, and embodied a lot of very hierarchical structures very quickly. As we undo those and become more flexible, we head back to something more like what Graeber and Wengrow were describing as a possibility of the human birthright, as what Francis Weller would call an initiation culture. In your view, if we head towards that, and I am assuming it would take a number of iterations, that might be a goal, and it might not be an ideal goal, and it's definitely not an end goal, and it would be an emergent thing. And 3 generations down the line, if they want to emerge something different, that's clearly up to them. But as we're trying to midwife this into being, what kind of things could we do to the existing democratic structure? I am assuming that, first of all, everything needs to be peaceful, and second, it would be very unlikely that the existing democratic structure will all go, okay, guys, it's not working, design us something new. We're going to have to take the existing structure and tweak it from the inside until it's somewhat more fit for purpose. Can you see steps on the way to that?
So let me start with metaphors and then turn to specific technologies, toolkits, let me say. So I love what you said about water. I know you meant it for a different purpose, but I think it's a very powerful way to think about things. When you talk about transfer of power, I think the image in your mind is I hold a stone and I hand it to someone else. It's earth,
Right.
Or maybe when it's uncontrolled, that it's a fire, that it just rips across places. But another metaphor we can think about is water or air. Water flows. It doesn't either transfer or, burn. And air it's ambient. It's around us. And it, when it encounters an obstacle, it actually accelerates around that obstacle rather than colliding with it. So let me try to give a toolkit of some concrete designs that maybe feel a little bit more like air or water and a little bit less like earth or fire. I'm going to give some very concrete designs now, just to make, to move to the opposite extreme. So imagine that we had voting rules that privileged bridge building. So to be very, very concrete, imagine that you want to pass a bill in the House of Commons, and if you have votes only from one side, you need a very large supermajority. But if you have equal amounts of votes from both sides, you need just a majority. So that would create a completely different dynamic in terms of, you wouldn't form a coalition at one point or have a government at one point. That would be self-defeating, because you would quickly get yourself into a situation where you need so many votes to pass anything that you can't get anything done. You would instead constantly be crossing the aisle. But even that is too simplistic of a way to think of it, because once you're crossing the aisle all the time, well, then there becomes an incentive to just have 2 parties in name, but form these cross-party coalitions and constantly reinforce those same cross-party coalitions. So you can imagine an even more dynamic system where you're kind of keeping track of what have the alliances been in the past. And anything that crosses whatever the alliances are sort of gets upweighted relative to things that reinforce the existing patterns of allegiance. And if you had a system like that, again, very much like water flowing, there would be this constant need to look at what are the current patterns of division, what are the current alliances, and how can I bridge those alliances to do the next thing. And in that world, rather than getting yourself into the system where there's the blue and the red, I guess those are the colors you use for opposite meanings from what we use in the US. But anyway, yeah. The blue and the red and the orange and whatever that are constantly retrenched. In fact, precisely the opposite dynamic is encouraged, where nobody is a persistent ally. Nobody is a persistent enemy. The rules of the game make it so that creating constant reinforced groupings undermines your ability to get anything done. Whereas constantly shifting them, whoever is able to see those cross-cutting things is the person who can gain power. You see what I mean?
I do. I don't see how you get to that, though. Let's just stick with, it doesn't really matter whether it's your country or mine. You've got, at the moment, you've got 2 tribes. People elect members of those tribes because they think they know what they're going to do, which, then they change their minds. That's a separate thing. How do you pick your selected representatives? But so you've got maybe in the end 5, 6, 7 different parties, of which 2 are quite big and the rest are all small.
Yeah.
And there's something that, let's say, somebody in one of the small parties goes, we want proportional representation, you guys will want first past the post. How does the weighting, how does it actually work?
Yeah. Well, okay. So first we can talk about how it actually works as an end state, and then we can talk about how we get there. So how does it work as an end state? This is where things like quadratic voting come in. But quadratic voting is a system where people have votes they can allocate across different topics. And
you need to unpick quadratic voting a little bit more than that, because I have mentioned it once or twice, but people don't really get it because I'm very bad at describing it.
So I mean, I'm not going to get into mathematical details because I don't think it's really all that important. But basically, it's just everyone has a pool of votes that they can allocate, let's say, within a legislature on different bills, or for individuals, it might be on referenda or candidates. But if you put all your votes on one thing, you get less additional votes than if you spread them across many topics.
It costs more to pile a lot of votes on one place than it does to spread them out, essentially. Yes.
Exactly. So it allows you to express how important things are to you, and at the same time, it penalizes being an extremist or a dogmatist, or just focused on one thing. Now, quadratic voting is individualistic. It gives individuals those credits to then spend on things. But you could imagine instead using that same logic for groupings. So you could imagine that the number of votes that are, cast on an issue is the square root of the number of people within a particular party that vote on that issue. And
Right.
so if you have equal votes across the 2 parties, then you just need a majority. But if it's all within the same party, then you need a huge supermajority because there's a square root over the votes within that one party.
Hang on a second. So let me unpick this. If Labour, for ease of the arithmetic, Labour's got 100 people, so the square root is 10. But there's factions within Labour where one faction is let's say 9 people, and the square root of 9 is 3. It's not actually that different. So, then the remainder, the square root of 81 would be 9. And my capacity to do arithmetic on the fly is about to fall over. What happens? How does it change when there's factions within a party that want different things? How is it weighted? Is it still weighted on? So Labour's got 100 people, so you've got 10 votes, and you have to decide how to split them up, or does a faction get together and go, okay, we're the AV faction, or we're the PR faction, we're the liquid democracy faction, and there are 9 of us, so we have 3 votes. Is that how it would work?
I mean, look, I think all the sorts of questions you're asking are great ones, and the answer is you could design it in a variety of ways.
Okay.
These ideas that you take a faction and you, if they're in a coherent faction, downweight it, and therefore you encourage cooperation across factions.
Right.
That's the basic conceptual framework and the mathematics you can use to do it. But then what you do with it precisely in any particular context is going to depend on who's designing it and what the goals are. And I think that's what's powerful about this, which is that you don't have to just say, oh, the United Kingdom from now on is going to use X system. Instead, what you can say is the Labour Party is worried about factionalism within it. So it is going to define it in this particular way in order to get a more dynamic and solidaristic Labour Party. And the Conservative Party could do the same internal to them, and the Liberal Democrats could do it internal to them. And then once everyone sees, well, that's working better, and that's making those parties more cohesive and doing better, well, then everyone becomes familiar with it and sees that it's good for the parties. So why not hold a referendum on whether we shouldn't have some system like that for the country as a whole?
Okay.
And it can grow out of the dynamics of the ways that the parties have experimented with it. So it doesn't have to be a totalizing, here's the design for the future. It can be, this is a tool. The same way that if some people start using word processing rather than just typewriters, then and it works well and it's more efficient, then other people can use it and adapt it in their own ways. They don't have to just implement the system of word processing. That's nonsense, right? It's a tool
Right.
to be adapted by humans in their social context with each other as a way of empowering them to accomplish their common goals, not a system to be imposed by
Okay.
some designer,
No, that makes a lot of
on
sense.
someone else.
So what we're aiming for is exactly what you said with the quilt. We're aiming for the cross stitching. We're aiming to find the ways that we can give people the capacity to be more emotionally literate, I would say.
Yeah.
Because listening, if you talk to certainly the politicians in this country, they don't start off being the kind of people who inhabit the cesspit of Twitter at its worst. They start off being human beings who want to make things better. And the system constrains them to become more and more robotic and increasingly locked into a particular stance. So what we're doing is giving them the capacity to engage their emotional literacy by talking to other people and by forming alliances. Yes?
Yeah. If we create a system where your incentive is every time you meet someone to say, what is it that I share with you first?
Right.
What can we accomplish together? And give them a sense that the more that that person is in a camp that I wouldn't usually communicate with, the more that they're a marginalized person for me, the more incentive I have to seek out those commonalities, right?
Yep.
Because that will give us power to do things together.
Okay. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And this is what you define in the book as liquid democracy. Am I right? Have I understood what you just said and what liquid democracy
Well, I
is?
mean, liquid democracy usually is meant as a particular system where you can transfer your votes to someone else and whatever. But this is more generally, the principles of plural voting, and liquid democracy could play a role in there, just as quadratic stuff plays a role in there. But what I'm trying to describe is illustrations of a bunch of tools, including liquid democracy, that can help us, get to that world of peacemaking political systems.
Okay, thank you. And it's all in the book. I am reading the particular chapters on democracy many times at the moment, trying to mine them and get them into my head. Slowly, very slow head. Can we take a step back and look at how you and Audrey came to write the book? And because it seems
Absolutely.
that Taiwan is a place where this is happening. It's because when I talk to people about this, often I get, yeah, but that's not practical. Can't do that here. And the narrative is the narrative that the current system is the best there is and there is no alternative. And democracy is a living example of the fact that there is an alternative and it works. So tell us just a little bit, just riff on how you met Audrey, what you're doing, what's happened in Taiwan, and where you see that going.
So I met Audrey back in 2018 at the introduction of Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, someone who maybe you've talked about in some of your previous podcasts. And Audrey and I initially started just working together. We remotely, we started working on quadratic voting in Taiwan and so forth. But I had the opportunity to meet her in Germany. And ultimately, meeting her and being with her and working with her changed my life more than anything we did together. Because she is someone who embodies this idea of being the water in just how she is. And we can talk about designs and tools and so forth, and those are all wonderful. That's what I made my life around. I was a professor of economics, and I'm a technologist, and I work at Microsoft some of the time. And so that's all great. But ultimately, that way that she is changed who I am, and really redefined the mission for my life. And that has ultimately been more important than any of the particular things we've worked on together. Taiwan is a fascinating place. I think the simplest way to understand why it's so fascinating is that it's, at least according to the UN, the largest set of stateless people in the world, because there are 4 million people who live in a jurisdiction that the United Nations does not recognize, that is not able to participate internationally as a nation, and where the people inside of the jurisdiction itself do not agree on what the jurisdiction is. They have a government right now that does not recognize the name of the country and does not recognize the flag that's associated with that country. So that's a set of people who, if they are going to succeed, if they are going to be prosperous, and they have, in fact, they are, of any jurisdiction of more than 10 million people, they have the highest median income. They've succeeded in the face of this tremendous existential plurality, ambiguity, disagreement about what they are. They're also the second most religiously plural jurisdiction in the world.
What's the first?
And one of the Singapore.
Okay.
And they are the only major developed jurisdiction where there's actually been an increase in religious observance and spirituality in recent years rather than a decline. So this is just, it's a tinderbox, and yet it's a tremendously successful tinderbox. And so if you want to look for opportunity to make those things work better in the world, you got to go to the place where it really matters, where like the stakes are high and where people are really living with the challenges every day and struggling their way through them. And if they've managed to find a way through them, like that is where to look for innovation along these dimensions,
This is probably an unanswerable question, but it seems to me that Audrey did not arise in a vacuum, and yet was absolutely central to a lot of the ways that they've managed to harness software in innovative social technologies. Would it be the place that it is without her, do you think? Were there enough people around her who might have got there alone? Or is she one of those people who genuinely changes the way the world is because they're in the right place at the right time with the right ideas?
I mean, my general concept of leadership comes back to this thing that I said before about the way that each of us has to embody complexity. And I don't think one should think about leadership either as individual or collective. You have to think about it as sort of the individual as being a microcosm for those conflicts between the collective. If you embody contradictions yourself, if you are torn apart by those contradictions, and yet you survive, you become a laboratory, a shibboleth, of the possible resolutions of those conflicts. I have some dear friends who are at their core torn to pieces by what's going on in Israel and Palestine. People who have family who have been generals on, one side of the war, and yet also are, have family who are killed on the other side of the war. You can imagine just the trauma that creates. And yet if you're able to survive that trauma and to somehow repair after it, you have a unique gift to give the world. And I think that's very much what Audrey was. Audrey had a heart condition, which meant that if she ever experienced intense emotion, especially anger, before the age of 12, she had a 50% chance of dying, and she was frequently hospitalized. And of course, it's not like she's the only person who's ever had that heart condition, but many of those people die. Somehow she survived. And as a result of surviving, she has something to offer the world, a way of coping with those things, a way of living on the edge of death, and yet thriving there somehow. And similarly, her gender non-binarity came out of that because as a, expected to be male, she was expected when she was bullied to defend herself, as I was expected as a child to defend myself. But I could do that. If she did that, would die. And so she had to find a way to not have that expectation. And that's an important part of how she discovered her femininity, So I think that people who undergo struggles like this, if they're able to make it through, have a gift to offer other people. So I don't think it's either that Audrey is this completely singular individual. It's rather that she was the site for this set of social forces that came to play in Taiwan. And because she survived it, she brought something special to help Taiwan see through these terrible challenges that they faced.
And now she's stepped back a little bit from being the Minister for Technology. And can you tell us a little bit about where she's moving into?
Well, she stepped down 3.5 weeks ago now, maybe a little bit longer when this releases. And she did that because she felt that so much of what she had to give Taiwan had come to fruition. And there was so much need in the world for the things that she had to offer. And that was the purpose of our book, of this film that we made about her life, and now of the role that was just announced yesterday as of this taping, she will be playing in helping to define an alternative future for social media through Project Liberty's bid to turn TikTok into a consumer cooperative, WeTalk, as we sometimes refer to it. And so my hope is that over the coming month, working together, she can help be a representative to the world of in the jurisdictions that are feeling the most pain from conflict, of what that possibility of a different social media, different democracy, harnessing the tools that they used in Taiwan could be like. And that's why we're so delighted to be talking to you all in the UK, a place that has seen many challenges and traumas with polarization and conflict in recent years.
Yeah. Yeah, we would struggle to find many nations in the world that haven't seen polarization and traumas.
Yes.
But yes, thank you. Alrighty, we're nearly done and I need to let you go. But just very briefly, some of the things that you've done in your background before you came to Plurality are utterly remarkable. Can you tell us a little bit about Radical Exchange to begin with, and then the rest of what you're doing within Microsoft? Because I find it really heartening that somebody like you is there with the ideas that you have making things happen. It feels less as if we're facing megaliths out there whose sole job is to harness our attention or harvest our attention and weaponize it against us. You're in there making change and making difference.
Yeah. So I, like Audrey, have been on many different sides of conflicts. I was a socialist campaigner. I was a founder of the Teenage Republican Organization in the United States. I was a technocratic economist and, involved in grassroots movements. And
Can I just interrupt? Something I heard
yeah.
you say, and I just want to verify this. You were starting as some young Republican something in the hierarchy at the point when Ivanka Trump was leading the Democrats. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, so I was at a elite private school. I guess what you would call them a elite public
That's
school
okay. We know what you
in
mean. Yes.
the UK. Yeah, yeah. And I was the head of the Young Republicans at that school, and then eventually in a nationwide capacity. And she was a few years ahead of me and the head of the Young Democrats at the time.
Awesome.
So I've lived in these different communities. I feel what they feel strongly. I've worked in the tech world and the business world. I was geopolitical advisor to the CTO of Microsoft for a period of time. So I know all these perspectives. I feel them. I know where they're coming from. I know what those worlds are like and what they struggle with. And I don't see any of them as my enemy. I see them all as parts of myself to struggle with and to reconcile. And, Audrey calls herself a conservative anarchist. And, the way I make sense of that is I think that, one form of an anarchist is someone who wants to abolish the state. And another form of an anarchist is one who thinks that the state is a fiction. And that what really exists out there is diverse networks of people trying to find a way to do things together with different wrappers put around that, you know,
Yeah.
and the state being one of those, and Microsoft Corporation being another of those, and so forth. And so, like, that's very much how I think about corporations. They have their system with structures of incentives and meaning
And
making and so
complex
forth.
systems.
Yeah, and there's no one thing that speaks for them, and they are not one thing. And so there are ways to create islands intersecting across these different organizations that are, um, can be quite powerful
Mm,
and agents of change, you
right.
know? And uh, that's what we've tried to build, always intersectionally in all these different places. Radical Exchange is an organization funded by primarily, though not exclusively, by a crypto billionaire, Vitalik Buterin, but also by a number of foundations that works at the intersection of culture and, uh, you know, crypto technology and uh, politics. And at Microsoft, at this Plural Technology Collaboratory, we're a research group within a corporation interacting closely with a number of academic collaborators, as well as with governments and so forth. So all of these, if you want to build anything new, I believe you cannot do it de novo, because if you do it completely de novo, if you do it in a position from nowhere, you actually end up replicating many of the worst elements of the system. What you actually have to do is stitch together existing things, each with their dysfunctions,
Hmm.
and try to weave from those dysfunctions something more beautiful than what you started with. So that's how I'm at peace spending time at Microsoft and spending time with governments and spending time in all these areas. As long as you know that you cannot start from nowhere and that you need to use existing systems, but that also if you just replicate those existing systems, you've accomplished nothing.
That's so
Yeah.
heartening, Glenn. Honestly, realizing that you exist and that there is this level of deep thought that does stretch into organizations and businesses and politics and governance, and that people are listening to you. And it must be such a breath of fresh air for someone who has found themselves locked into the binaries that our system creates, to have someone like you come along and go, you don't need to, the binaries don't need to be there. What happens if we let them go? I can imagine waking up in the morning feeling so much more liberated as a human being, as an emotional, energetic being, when that offer is being made by somebody who, there can't be so many people like you who have been on all the different sides of the aisle, and then stepping back and going, guys, we don't even need an aisle. Let's dream up something else. Do you find
Or,
that
or, or, may,
response?
or maybe we do need an aisle and we need to be on both sides of it at the same time. That like that, and that's something that water can do,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
So like one option is to be on no to be for there to be no aisle. Another is to be on one side, and a third is that there's a river that runs between the two sides of the aisle, and it's hard to say where the river begins and ends, because any individual molecule of water is on one side of the aisle or another, and yet all the molecules of water are connected to each other. Audrey says that the easiest position is actually to be on all sides of a conflict, not on no side or on one side. And uh, she says that she is non-binary, but not mostly on gender. She's non-binary on politics. She's non-binary on gender. She's non-binary on these things, and she's non-binary about being non-binary. So
Right.
for her pronouns, she uses star/star,
Right.
which is a technical thing. So when you are saying like you have a API, a application programming interface, and you have to ask what does it receive as inputs, you can put different formats of files, or you can put star/star, which means can receive any format of file. And so that's Audrey's pronoun is star/star.
Oh, I love it. I have to build that into the title somehow. Wow. Oh gosh. Okay, so now I'm already riffing on the next book. That's such an interesting idea. Glenn, I need to let you go. That was fantastic. Is there anything else in this field? Because that feels like a really lovely way to end. But if there was anything else that you wanted to
Why
say,
don't we
now is
just
your
leave
time
it
to
there? I
say.
think that's wonderful.
So thank you, Glenn, for coming on to the Accidental Gods podcast. It's been such a delight and an honour. And I look forward to seeing where /star takes us, and Plurality. I will put links in the show notes because everybody needs to read it.
Thank you so much, Amanda.